The smell of Hakata Bay was not of the sea. It was of sulfur and wet ash. It was a sharp, biting stench that coated the back of the throat, alien and terrifying to men who had only ever known the smell of iron and horse sweat. Kayo, a 30-year-old retainer of the Shoni clan, crouched behind the dripping masonry of the Genko Barui, the great stone defensive wall that stretched for 20 kilometers along the coast like a jagged scar. It was the night of June 22, 1281. The rain was a constant. Miserable drizzle that turned the sandy soil into a grinding paste that worked its way into the joints of his Yoroi armor, chaffing the skin raw. Takaway's normal was the ache in his knees from crouching in the mud for 6 hours straight. It was the constant, rhythmic pounding of the Mongol war drums drifting across the black water from the massive armada anchored offshore a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated in the teeth. His reality was defined by the 2 yards of rough-hewn stone wall in front of him and the shivering form of his nephew, Kenji, beside him. Kenji was 16, holding a Yumi longbow with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He was staring into the darkness, jumping at the sound of every wave slapping the shore, waiting for the monsters to emerge from the mist. "They say they have iron pots," Kenji whispered, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to hide. "They say they throw lightning that tears men apart without a blade touching them." "They are men, Kenji," Takeo rasped, wiping the rain from his eyes with a callous hand. "They bleed like us. They die like us. The thunder is just noise to scare children." Takeo lied. He had seen the Tetsutha thunder crash bombs during the first invasion 7 years ago. He had seen a horse and rider turned into red mist by a ceramic shell filled with gunpowder and shrapnel. He knew the war had changed. It was no longer a duel of honor between samurai calling out their lineages. It was an industry of slaughter, a machine of war brought from the continent to grind them into dust. The chaos is normal. State was evident in the logistics behind the wall. The beach defense zone was a slurry of mud trampled by thousands of straw sandals. Runners moved back and forth like ants in a disturbed colony, carrying bundles of arrows and rice balls wrapped in damp leaves. There was no glory here, only the grind of waiting for the tide to bring the enemy. It was 3 o'clock. The tide was coming in. The Mongol ships, heavy and ominous silhouettes against the dark gray sky, were beginning to lower their landing craft. The drums beat faster, a heartbeat accelerating into tachycardia. Then came the disturbance. It wasn't a bomb, it was a silence. Where there should have been the noise of salvation, a runner, Lorenking Ashigaru, named Hideo, slid into the mud beside Takeo. He was breathless, his face streaked with oil and grime. He wasn't carrying the heavy bundle of fresh arrows Takeo had requested an hour ago. He was carrying nothing but bad news. "The arrows," Takeo demanded, grabbing the man's shoulder, shaking him slightly. "The quiver is half empty. If they land, we need the heavy shafts to punch through their leather." Hideo shook his head, his eyes wide with a specific bureaucratic terror that Takeo recognized from the faces of men who had seen the maps and knew the math didn't add up. "No arrows, my lord. The supply train, ... The convoy from Dazefu. It stopped. The road is clear. We hold the rear." "Why did it stop?" "The convoy never arrived at the beachhead," Hideo whispered, leaning close so the other men wouldn't hear the morale-breaking truth. "I spoke to the quartermaster. He received a rider from the inland castle. The order to resupply the beach defenses was rescinded at midnight." Takeo felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the rain or the armor. Rescinded. By whom? By the High Command. They are hoarding the supplies at the inland fortress. They ... They don't think the wall will hold against the numbers. They are preparing for the siege at Dasafu. We are the delay, my lord. We are not the defense. The order rescinded too late was the death knell. The machinery of survival, the belief that the entire might of Japan was behind them at the wall was a lie. The convoy of arrows, food, and reinforcements that was supposed to bolster their line at dawn was sitting in a warehouse 10 miles inland, guarded by men who had already written off the vanguard. Takayo and his men were a speed bump, a calculated sacrifice to buy time for the real army to dig in behind them. Takayo looked at Kenji, who was checking his bowstring for the 100th time, muttering a prayer to Hachiman. He couldn't tell the boy. If the men knew they were abandoned, the line would break before the first Mongol boot hit the sand. "The arrows are coming," Takayo lied, his voice steady as granite. The mud slowed the carts. Make every shot count until then. The confusion and fatigue of the weeks of waiting hardened into a brittle, icy resolve. The instability of human judgment. Lords counting bushels of rice while men stood on the precipice had clarified Takayo's world. There was no retreat. There was no tomorrow. There was only the water, the stone, and the enemy. Then the darkness screamed. A flash of light erupted from one of the approaching landing craft, followed by a deafening crack boom. A Tetsu bomb arced over the wall, trailing sparks like a demon, and exploded 20 yards down the line. It sent shrapnel and screaming men into the mud. The smell of sulfur became overpowering. "Shields!" Takayo roared, slamming his shoulder against the stone. The landing craft hit the sand. The ramps dropped. They didn't charge like samurai, screaming names and challenges. They poured out like a hive swarming. The Mongols fought in a phalanx, shields locked, spears bristling, moving in perfect, terrifying unison to the sound of gongs. They wore heavy leather armor boiled in lacquer, impervious to light arrows. They were a machine, loose. Takayo commanded, "Kenji," and the other archers fired. The arrows struck the Mongol shields with a sound like rain on a roof. Some found gaps, dropping men, but the mass kept moving. Inexorable as the tide, Takayo drew his tachi, the long, curved sword. He stepped up to the lip of the wall. The first wave hit the defenses. It was a brutal, grinding collision. The Mongols tried to scale the stones. The samurai thrust spears down into their faces. It was intimate, horrific violence. Takayo severed, a hand gripping the stonework, then drove his blade into the neck of the man behind. "Hold the wall," he screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony. He looked for the reinforcements. He looked for the banners of the Kyushu lords that should be rushing to the beach to throw the invaders back into the sea. The path behind them was empty. The rain blurred the road, but it couldn't hide the emptiness. The convoy was not coming. The realization stripped Takayo of his fear. He was a dead man walking, and a dead man has no rules. "Kenji, drop the bow." "Spear!" Takayo yelled as a Mongol warrior vaulted the wall, swinging a heavy mace. Kenji fumbled for his spear, thrusting blindly. The Mongol deflected it, raising the mace to crush the boy's skull. Takayo stepped in, abandoning his defensive posture, and drove his shoulder into the Mongol's chest, knocking him back off the wall into the churning mass below. The battle raged for hours. It was a slow-burn nightmare of exhaustion. Takeo fought. Mechanically, block, strike, breathe. Block, strike. His arms felt like lead. His armor weighed 1,000 pounds. The mud was slick with blood. The Mongols, realizing the wall wouldn't break easily, pulled back slightly to regroup and bombard the defenses with more explosives. The lull was worse than the fighting. It gave the men time to think, time to look back at the empty road. "They aren't coming, are they, Uncle?" Kenji whispered, leaning against the blood-slicked stone. He wasn't crying, he was just empty. His youth had burned away in the fires of the Tetsu. Takayo looked at him. "No," Takayo said softly. They aren't. Then why are we fighting? Because this is where we are, Takeo said. And because if we don't, they will burn everything behind us. Even the cowards in the castle. Takeo looked out at the bay. The Mongol fleet was massive, a city on the water. But something was happening. The wind was changing. The rain, which had been a drizzle, was turning into a driving sheet. The waves were picking up, crashing against the landing craft, smashing them against the rocks. The divine wind, the kamikaze, was beginning to stir, though they didn't know it yet. It started as a low howl, a vibration in the air that rivaled the Mongol drums. But Takeo saw an opportunity. The Mongols were struggling with the surf. Their coordination was breaking. The landing craft were fouling each other. They are trapped. Against the water, Takeo shouted, his voice rasping. They cannot retreat. The boats are smashing. Climbed up onto the top of the wall. He stood silhouetted against the gray sky, a lone figure against the might of an empire. For Hakata, for the abandoned. He roared. He jumped. He didn't jump back to safety. He jumped down onto the beach into the mass of the Mongol Vanguard. It was a suicide move, but it triggered the machinery of survival in the other men. Seeing their leader charge, the shame of staying behind the wall was greater than the fear of death. Banzai. Hundreds of samurai poured over the wall, abandoning the defense to become the avalanche. They hit the Mongol line with the fury of the betrayed. In the tight confines of the beach, with the storm rising and the boats crashing, the Mongol phalanx couldn't maneuver. Their long spears were useless in the crush. The samurai closed in with swords and daggers. Takeo was a whirlwind. He didn't fight for the shogun. He fought for the inch.